Jesus Christ. I thank you all for actually this great attendance this evening. This is quite interesting to see such a large gathering of youth. And I hope not to bore you with medicine and science tonight. But as George had mentioned, the interest in the shroud actually was piqued in me by hearing stories about it and really never understanding what it was. And so what you see in front of you here on the screen is the face of the person who is in the shroud. And obviously, it's not a matter of faith whether you believe this is the actual burial sheet of Jesus Christ or not, although most people who have seen it have come to that belief in itself. Personally, I have my own belief that it is, but I'm not here to convince you of it. I'm just here to show you exactly what the shroud is. So the shroud is a linen. It's 14 feet long and about 3.5 feet wide. And what you see on the bottom of the screen here in the white sepia color is actually the color that you would see if you were to visit it, if it was on exposition in the cathedral. The top copy, which is in the black and white, is actually a photographic negative. And the features of the man on the shroud are actually much clearer. And we're going to be reviewing this in some detail. But just to show you what the burial customs were in ancient Israel at the time, and probably not different in many parts of the world today, is that the body of the deceased would have been washed and placed in a tomb, but it would have been wrapped in some kind of linen. This depiction that you see up here is an artistic rendering of perhaps how an individual may have been buried in those days, and in fact it testifies to what we see on the shroud itself. This is again a typical tomb in which a body would have been laid, and oftentimes there were niches in which the body was placed in with the shroud just placed over. Now, if you remember your stories from the gospel, is that they had to rush the burial of Jesus Christ because it was the Sabbath. And so they really didn't have time to do what you would normally do with a body, that is wash it and oil and put sacred oils and spices on the body. Instead, they had to rush this burial, and the plan was for the women to go to the tomb and actually finalize the burial rites, which didn't quite happen as we understand it from the Gospels. Here you can see cross-section of what a tomb would have been like. There may have been sand placed at the bottom of the niche for the body to lie in. And obviously, just like we do oftentimes in the Mediterranean today, the body would decompose in situ, and then the bones would be collected and placed in an ossuary many years later after the body had decomposed. So why do I begin my story in 1978 with the shroud? Is because there was to be a public exhibition in Torino, which is a northern Italian city close to the French border, in which the shroud is actually housed and has been there for over 400 years at this point. And back in the old days, when the shroud was exhibited, it was done in this manner. There would be several priests or bishops holding up the linen cloth, showing it to the public, and obviously that's not how it's done any longer today, but these are prints from old books. What you see here, again, drawing back to what I mentioned before, is the two different color schemes here. The one on the left, you can see quite clearly an image of a man with his arms crossed in front of him. And the black and white version is actually a photograph. And what you actually see, the features of this man are much clearer in the negative than in the positive. And the only reason that this has come, we've discovered this image, is since the era of photography. Back in the days when the shroud was carried from place to place throughout Europe, they only had the human eyes to look at it. There was no such thing as a camera, and therefore no one could look at a photographic negative. So in fact, what you do see in the black and white image here is a photographic negative, which is really the impression that was left on the shroud. It's as if there was a photographic mechanism which the image of Christ was incorporated. So here is the palace in Torino. Don't forget, Italy at one time was run by, was the kingdom of Italy, and had a king. Palace in Torino is where eventually the shroud was taken, simply because the kings of Italy came from Savoy, which was in France, where the shroud was originally brought to after Constantinople. And it was housed there with the changing of where the throne of the Kingdom of Italy was to be placed, and that's why it's in this part of the world today. This is actually the Basilica of St. John the Baptist, in which the shroud is kept. And this, at the time of the exhibition when I was there the first time, this is exactly how we would see it. As you entered the church, it was in a large case enclosed in glass, and this lighting was on it. And when you look at it, you say, well, really, I don't see much of anything. And it's interesting that there is a pivotal distance in which you need to sit or stand in order to see the image. And it's somewhere between 10, 12 feet away. If you get too close, you lose focus. If you get too far, this is what you see, is pretty much nothing other than these distracting marks. So for those of you who have handouts in front of you, and the reason I made it is because I kind of want to go over a little bit with you what you actually see on the cloth that is distracting you from looking at the image. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is the length of the shroud. It's about 14 and 3.5 feet wide, and it fits the 8x2 cubits that's mentioned in the ancient records of measurements in the Middle East. This is kind of the weave. It's a herringbone type of weave. But this one is peculiar in that it was more typical of coming from North Africa, Egypt, more than it was from the Middle East, and certainly was not to be found in Europe during the time of the 1st century. So we have a back and front image of a man here, and I know we focused mostly on the face before, but if you look to the right of the screen, you can clearly see the face. However, if you just move your eyes slightly to the left, you'll see kind of an indistinct image, which is really the back of the head. So think of it this way. The shroud was laid under the body and then draped over the front of the body with the head as the area of the fold. So in order to understand and read the image on the shroud much better, you need to get rid of all those other images that you see that you'll have on your papers in front of you, which are somewhat distracting. So you'll see a linen that has various tints to it. Some of it is white, some of it's off-white, some is actually sepia-colored. But you'll also see burn and scorch marks, because the shroud has been through some trials. There are water stains to put out the fire. There are blood stains which originate from the image of the man on the shroud. There are folding marks on the shroud. And there are various dots and dirt, wrinkles and folds and patches and stitching. All of this can be very distracting when you're looking at it. So here, what you see these white triangles. These are actually openings in the shroud because this was an area in which the shroud was burnt during a fire. This happened in 1352, and the Poor Clare nuns who took care of the relic actually patched it with Holland linen, and they sewed it onto the back. And that covered the holes in this way the shroud wouldn't rip any further. And you see long dark marks going across, which actually again are singe marks from that original fire. And then there are other stains, other bigger triangles that I don't know how clearly it projects on this, but they're actually water stains. Obviously, when the chapel caught fire, the shroud was kept in a silver reliquary box. The silver actually began to melt, and droplets of molten silver fell onto the cloth. And that's what started the fire on the cloth itself. And whoever salvaged it actually threw tons of water onto the box, and it stained the cloth, but nonetheless saved the image. That was in 1352. However, there was another fire in 1997 when the Cathedral of St. John was being restored, and an acetylene torch caught fire. And this fireman on the left, dressed in red, actually became a national hero in Italy because he went in single-handedly with an axe and broke the unbreakable glass in which the reliquary was kept and dragged it out. And so he had a day of honor in Italy because he actually salvaged the shroud again. This would be like the third time that this relic had been in danger of being burnt up by fire. So before the 1352 fire, though, there was another fire. And you see these burn marks here. And it looks like this may have been a burn from incense or candle. And the only reason we know that this is way before 1300 is because of a manuscript in the National Library in Budapest, Hungary. This is probably one of the original books written in the Hungarian language, which is kind of like a gospel itself. And on this particular manuscript, you see in the oval circle there, those burn marks that I just pointed out over here. You see it looks like an L, an inverted L, and you'll see it here. So back in at least the 1100s, if not earlier, whenever this manuscript was done, they already had a visualization of burn marks on the shroud. So we realize that this cloth underwent several times of tragedy, and luckily enough was saved for posterity. And here again, just to highlight that these are burn marks that go from the past. So how did the shroud get to Europe to start with, if it is the burial cloth of Christ? Well, there are lots of theories, and I sustain, along with many other people, that the shroud was saved only because in Jewish custom, you would become unclean if you touched anything that was in contact with the dead. And so how could it be then a burial cloth that was bloodied, that had dirt on it, and was in contact with a dead man, be salvaged by the Jews? Well, obviously Jesus' followers made sure that that didn't happen. But how did it leave Israel? How did it get out of that empire where everything was at risk? If you were just a Christian, you were at risk. So there's a theory of King Abgar and Edessa. And there are lots of different stories weaved around it, but it does seem that ultimately the face of Christ, because even in the West there's you have the story of Veronica, the veil of Veronica. And it is thought that the veil of Veronica and the Abgar story of King Abgar, who maybe was a leper, heard of this miracle worker in Palestine and decided to send an emissary to go ask him if he can come heal him. And Jesus obviously refused and said, no, I need to stay here with my people. And instead, a depiction of Christ was sent to King Abgar. And that's a story. And I think what the story tries to tell is, how could an image of Christ's face get all the way up to Edessa, which is today in Turkey, and in that period of time? Well, it could be that this cloth, which was only shown the face of Christ on it at one time, actually was the basis for that story. And if I had 3 days to go over this with you, I would also tell you on how that story weaves into iconography in Eastern Christianity. As you well know, the face of Christ has been depicted in the very same fashion for a millennium and a half at least. Very early on in the Roman days, in very early Rome, Christ, as depicted in the catacombs of Rome, etc., had a young man's face, beardless. He almost looked like the god Apollo. But his image didn't change until around the 5th century. And that's a story I don't want to diverge on. I want to pay attention to actually the shroud itself. But just to give you some context, that there are a lot of stories around the history of the shroud, where it was, how it got to where it is. Ultimately, in the year 944, the Byzantine emperor decided that this relic needed to be in his royal chapel. And he sent a large army of men to convince the bishops of Edessa that this is what they were to do. After a lot of wrangling, exchange of monies, and prisoner exchanges, they gave him the relic. On August 15th, in 944, they took it back to Constantinople. And there's actually a feast day in the Byzantine church that commemorates the bringing of the Vanillin, or Christ's face, to Constantinople, and it's celebrated in the church on August 16th. And then we remember what happened in Constantinople. This was in the 900s. The Crusades happened. And the Fourth Crusade in 1200s, they sacked the city of Constantinople, robbed it of many of its treasures, and that was the last that we heard of the Shroud of Turin. It wasn't called Shroud of Turin then, it was just called the Holy Shroud of Christ. And it wound up in Europe, because most of the Crusaders were Franks, and a lot of them were dukes. And one of them was a Duke of Athens after the conquest of what was then the Greek world. And it appears in Lille, France, in the late 1300s, you start to hear of the Shroud of Christ for the first time in the Western world. And from there, history is very consistent. There's clear documentation that this cloth existed in Western Europe. So, lo and behold, this is what we have now in Torino, Italy. And this, again, is just to show you a little bit about the burn marks, and I really don't want to spend too much time on this, but all the distortions that you see on the cloth really are a result of these fires. So this is what it looked like when I went there for the first time to see the shroud, and you can see the famous carabinieri, Italian carabinieri with the plume feather hats. And this was Pope John Paul II also praying before it. And this is when the studies occurred in the 1970s. There were scientific studies that happened, that needed to happen to really try to find out what this image was, how it was left on the cloth, and why so much mystery. Many scientists were involved. A lot of them were NASA scientists. And there was a group called STIRP, which is an acronym for the name of their group, but these were astrophysicists, these were hematologists, these were surgeons. There were people of every scientific walk of life who were interested and were invited to come and study the shroud. In the study, the preparation for the study took months, but the study itself was only allowed to go on for a week, the actual hands-on investigation. So dirt samples were taken, pollen samples were taken, some threads were removed, and a piece of cloth was taken off from which they intended to do a carbon-14 dating. And you can see from some of these pictures the amount of work that was done. And just one point is that in 1983, this was still a private possession of the royal family of Italy, who was no longer the royal family of Italy because they were exiled after World War II. But upon the death of the last surviving king, the cloth was donated to the Vatican with the proviso that it needed to stay in Torino at the cathedral. Until today, that's truly the case, and it won't be moved from there. Again, the amount of studies that were done, believe it or not, the guy on the left is me, but that was back in 1998. And so I looked different. I had funky glasses, and I had black hair. And this was, we were able to examine the shroud and take pictures, et cetera, and participate in a lot of the scientific discussion that was going on. And certainly my participation was more to look at it from the forensics, from the anatomy perspective. So this is a close-up of the face on the shroud. This is a photographic negative, which gives you a positive image. Many of you here are way too young to remember the type of photo cameras we used to use, where you used to have rolls of film on the inside. But if any of you here are old enough to recall those days, when you used to get your photographs developed, and then you used to get copies of those on strips, there were your negatives. And you ever look at them, they're horrifying. You look at people's faces, you say, oh my God, those are monsters. The reality is that this is a negative, but this is not the face of a monster. Actually, this face is much more attractive than the face you see on the shroud with your own eyes. So it was discovered that the image is a photographic negative, and it's thanks to this gentleman here in 1898, Secondo Pia, who was a teacher. There was going to be an exhibition of the shroud for the first time in a long time in honor of the wedding of one of the Italian princesses. And he was friends with people in the royal family, and they said to him, take your funky camera, because don't forget, photography was fairly new back in those days, and take some pictures. And they had the shroud on exposition in the cathedral at night before the wedding was to happen. And he set up his photograph machine, and he snapped away with these giant machines. And back in those days, too, your negative plate was a giant piece of glass. Okay, it wasn't a roll in a camera. It was a big piece of glass. It had silver backing on it, etc. It was a very complicated process, and he took these plates back to his studio to develop it. And when he went back to the studio and developed it, he almost passed out because he couldn't believe what he saw, that what he couldn't see with his own eyes on the shroud, he was able to visualize on his glass negative. So the picture on the right is what he saw. And these are original photos of his plates. And you'll see some folds across the face, etc. And those are folds within the cloth, so it's very distorting. But what you can see of the face is quite clear. And again, these are just some photos. So if you were to take those very same negatives and start to look at the entire body, you can clearly see the arms crossed over, and you can clearly see that there are these white marks, look like they're going upstream on the arm, and it really has to do with the flow of blood, as the person on the cross was hung like this, and blood was flowing down from the nails in the palms and in the hands. And as you start to study this closely, you start to see everything that we read happening to Jesus during the crucifixion, right from our own Gospels. Again, on here, just to point out, all those big triangles are nothing but patches of cloth that were placed over the holes of the burns, so don't let that distort what you're focusing on. So the clearer pictures actually happen in the negative, and they're actually able to estimate the length of the individual who's displayed on the shroud, anywhere from 5'7" to 5'11". And because you could see this is full length. Now, the second gentleman who contributed to the photography and the exposition of the image on the shroud is this gentleman, Barry Schwartz. Doesn't sound like an Italian to me. Actually, he's Jewish from California. And I've spoken to Barry Schwartz several times. Barry was invited to the original 1970s exposition and studies, and he was responsible for most of the photography that was to happen. And he had real fancy machinery this time. It wasn't that big clunky machine. Just as a follow-up, Barry became a Christian. This was Max Fry, who was a pollen specialist. So he was a forensic scientist who was able to, with Scotch tape actually, go across the entire length and width of the shroud with his Scotch tape, collect dirt and pollen, and he ascertained that the pollen samples that were found on the shroud, for the grand majority, were all pollens that you would find in the Middle East, particularly Palestine, particularly at that time of year in which the crucifixion would have occurred. He also did find pollens from Turkey, because obviously if this cloth went to Edessa, that's exactly where it would be, and also pollen from Western Europe, where it was transported ultimately. So these are the type of studies that these individuals were doing at the time. And you can see here some pictures in the map of Israel on the bottom left is just to indicate the type of pollens that they find and where they found them. This is a 3D imaging because they also used another funky machine. Remember I told you that these gentlemen, a lot of them were from NASA. And they had a VP8 imager, which is something that you kind of use to make maps of the depths of valleys and the heights of mountains when you fly a satellite overhead. And what they found in doing that, when scanning the image on the shroud, that they could have created a 3D image so you could see the depths. This could not be done on a photograph. This could not be done on a painting. So many people have said, well, of course, the shroud is a medieval fraud. Somebody just took a dead body, put some oil and sweat and blood on it, and put a cloth on it, and heated it up, and blah, 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 and goes on, and they made this make-believe shroud. Well, if that were the case, there would have been nobody in medieval days who could have created a photographic negative, no less dupe a VP8 imager almost a half a century later. So again, I'm just giving you a very high level of the science that was done to study this cloth. And here again is, rough images, 3D images that were created by this VP8 imaging. And you can see clearly here in the different angles that you get a pretty good idea that this body was not a painted surface. So the forensics of the shroud, which is the area now of my interest and specialization, is what? Well, what does forensics mean? It means that you apply scientific knowledge to legal problems or scientific analysis of physical evidence. Okay, CSI does this a lot. And that's forensics. And I'm sure you watch CSI something, CSI LA and Miami and whatever. But in essence, that's what you do. You have evidence in front of you, you have pieces of information, and you try to apply it to a riddle or to solve a mystery. So how do we work? What kind of forensic pieces do we have? We have this cloth, but we also have other data that we want to work with, and we want to piece it together, so we use the Gospels. So if the shroud is authentically the burial cloth of Jesus, it must corroborate with the accounts that we have in the Gospels, and really shouldn't differ that much. Now, many people will say, well, the Gospels were written by people who may or may not have been eyewitnesses, et cetera, but they're consistent. And not only are they consistent, but we also know from archaeology that what Roman execution or crucifixion was like, because Jesus certainly was not the only man to be crucified. It was a rather common form of execution, which actually was invented by the Persians. The Romans just happened to perfect it. And what they did to the individuals was not to want to kill them immediately, but to make them suffer so that they would set an example for other criminals. So what I'm going to show you for the rest of the presentation actually has to do about the method of crucifixion and what we see on the shroud. So I hope nobody has a weak stomach. But we know from the Gospels here that Jesus was beaten, he was scourged, he was crowned with thorns, he carried his cross, he was nailed to the cross, he died, his side was pierced, and then ultimately he was buried. So here's a close-up of the face. And so what do the Gospels say about he being beaten? Well, you can read from Luke here that they struck him on the face. And so what do we see on the shroud here? Well, we see a nose, we see a mustache, we see a beard, we see eyes, but we also see cheeks that seem to be more than prominent. And they're darker, but the darkness is not just from an image, but also it's from blood. What you can see on the forehead here as well is a rippling effect. It's almost like a backwards 3, and that's a riplet of blood. And all the darker images that you see on the face are actually blood. And how do we know it's blood? Because on the shroud itself, the blood actually stains from the front to the back of the cloth. You can actually, when you turn the shroud around, you actually see the blood penetrating through the backside of the cloth. Whereas all the other image that you see here is only a micromillimeter deep into the threads, does not penetrate to the backside. So if one were to say, this was painted on, any liquid would be absorbed through and through. You don't have this happen. The only thing that is through and through are blood stains or secretions, body secretions. And so that's why there is a mystery still surrounding how this image is left. So we also know that Jesus was scourged, and the Romans call it the flagrum. And the flagrum just wasn't a belt, okay? It wasn't a leather belt. It was multiple strands of leather, and usually on the ends of it were tied pieces of sheep bone or plumbum, which is little, they almost look like dumbbells made of lead. And they did this so this way you wouldn't only just get scourged, but you would also have penetration into below the skin, into the muscle. And we see this again from the Gospels, verified there, another piece of forensics. But what happens on the cloth itself? You can actually see it on the papers that you have. I don't know if it's any clearer, but you can actually see linear slashes through the shoulders. This is the backside of that of the man on the shroud. Okay? And you can actually see linear slashes. And actually, with a lot of the technology that they had, they were able to count more or less how many of them there were. And it was pretty consistent with the 120 strokes. And of course, the schematic to the left is a much clearer picture than on the shroud itself. But this gives you an idea of how execution was performed at the time of crucifixion. And the picture, that little insert there with what appears to be the whips, that actually the plumbum on it. Actually, they are the pieces of lead. This is much closer. This image on the left by Giulio Ricci actually is a statue made as realistically as possible from the image on the shroud. And you can see quite clearly punctuation marks and striping. And this again, just to demonstrate what in numbers the sixth lash would have looked like. So Roman scourging didn't just limit to the back. If the strands were long enough, they crossed to the front of the body as well, and to the legs, to the thigh, etc. And again, this is the back of that statue, just again to demonstrate what that was looking like. Now, the crowning of thorns has always been one thing that was always intriguing to me, because this was not part of crucifixion method. This was pertinent only to Jesus' crucifixion. And why they did it was to taunt him and say, now you're a real king. We'll put a crown on your head. And because there is lots of writings from ancient writers about the crucifixion method, and scourging is part of it. The crowning of thorns is not. And so what they took was common thorn bush, weaved it into a basket-like crown, and placed it on the head. And again, for the forensics purposes, we have evidence in the Gospels that this was what happened, but we also have evidence of it on the shroud itself, that the head has these, over here on this particular picture, you'll see there are white stains, and that's just the blood dribbling down. And so we know that that's a little different than just being beaten on the head with a rod. So there was piercing of the scalp, and if anybody's ever worked at EMT or seen any kind of scalp cuts, it bleeds like heck. The scalp is probably one of the bloodiest parts of your skin, and so there was considerable blood loss from this alone. And this was just a facsimile of what a weaved thorn bush crown could look like. So you can see that clearly in these images. So the picture on the right here is kind of an enhanced photograph done with what would be a heat map, if you would. And in the heat map here is to just demonstrate the closeness of the cloth to the body itself. So the closer part of the body was on the cloth, the redder it would be, and also the blood would pick up that way as well. So Christ carried his cross, but did he carry the cross the way it's depicted in here? Probably not. The cross was way too heavy. If you looked at the entire cross, it would have been way too heavy. So it was not uncommon to have the cross, at least the stipes, which would be the upright portion of the cross, in place at the place of execution, and just the cross beam would be carried by the prisoner. So again, from the Gospels, we know that he carried the cross himself. This map here is just to show you the distance he would have had to carry it. And of course, we know that he wasn't in health enough to carry it, and so Simon of Cyrene was recruited. And the reason that he would have not been able to carry this part of the cross was because of the severe beatings that he underwent and the scourging. And any man, even if well physically fit, may not have been able to do it himself as well. So here is just to give you an idea of what different crosses could look like, and there were all different types that were used throughout the Roman Empire, depended on where you were. But it is thought that in this case it may have been the Tau cross or the T cross, and that's the first one on the top left. And it would be assembled like this. So the prisoner would carry the crossbeam, and then it would be hoisted on to the stipes, and that would be how the cross would have looked. And of course, when they got to the place of execution, the arms were nailed first into the crossbeam and then hoisted upwards. And in order to carry this piece of wood, you would have had to, most likely had it tied to your arms as well. But what this shows here on the shroud is that we have evidence of tearing away of skin from the upper back and the shoulders, probably from the carrying of the crossbeam. And I know there's a lot of technology on this particular slide, but again, these are things that scientists are able to ascertain by doing in-depth studies here. And nails, yes, these are facsimiles of what nails were like back in that era. And actually, there are some nails still retained from archaeological digs. And there happens to be a tomb that was excavated in Jerusalem in which the heel of an individual had a nail still fixed through it who was crucified. And so these nails were quite large. They were meant to hold the weight of an individual, so they couldn't have been flimsy. And again, we know that from the Gospels, Jesus was crucified by being nailed. And these are pictures that come from various films that have been made about the Passion of Christ. And some of them will show you that the arms are tied to the cross as well as nailed, and some will not. So the one thing that comes to mind, though, is that if an individual was not tied on the cross beam, how would a nail through the palm of the hand sustain the weight of that individual? Well, what we see on the shroud is actually evidence that they couldn't have nailed through the palms, but had to go through the wrist. Because if you went through the palm, it would tear through. And here you can see these are the crossed hands, and you'll see that larger dark area which represents the blood flow. And also what you'll see going diagonally, you see flows of darkness, which is really blood that would have actually been dripping down the arms as they were extended this way. The other thing that you see in this picture too, you may see it this way, you can only account for 4 fingers on each hand. Why is that? And if this were a forgery that were done in the Middle Ages, why would any artist even think of only depicting 4 fingers and not 5? They wouldn't have had the information that was needed to know that, anatomically speaking, when a nail is gone through the wrist, you're also damaging or severing the median nerve, which would cause retraction of the thumb into the palm. And so when that occurs, you're only going to see 4 fingers sticking out. And this picture is gory, I understand it, but it's just to show you where it is anatomically. And you could see that there have been lots of studies done, believe it or not, on cadavers of driving nails through hands and feet to see what would happen. This one here, the Z area, is named after Dr. Zugubi, who actually did some of this experimentation. He's an anatomist. And realized that by putting it through any one of these spots, which would be an easy approach for a nail to penetrate through the wrist without breaking the bone, you would actually then sever the median nerve, which would give you a retracted thumb. And again, this is just showing that. So this here, again, showing what a man hanging on the cross, the blood flow from the wrists, how that would trickle down the back of the arm. And that's what we see when the arms are then crossed over the front of the body and the shroud is placed over it. And this here is a much closer look. Again, just more examples of that very same look. In regards to the feet, now obviously you weren't suspended from the feet, but the feet were affixed to the cross. And the sole purpose of that was so that the man who was crucified would be able to push himself up on the nail to catch a breath. Just imagine if you tie your arms to a doorpost and hang there, not crucified, just hang there from a doorpost, you'd have a hard time breathing in and out. At some point, you couldn't have your diaphragm expand. And the only way you could do it is if you had a stool under your feet and you were able to push up against it to relieve that pressure. So by affixing one's feet to the cross, to the wooden beam, you're able to do that. But every time you did that, you had to push up against the nail stuck in your feet. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the Romans perfected torture. And this would allow an individual on the cross to live for quite a long time. If they didn't die exsanguinated, they can live quite a long time, which wasn't the case in Jesus' particular case. But nonetheless, this was the reason why they did that. And on some crosses, they put a sedile, which actually was kind of like a a little stool for somebody to be able to push themselves off of, so this way they can breathe for a longer period of time before succumbing to asphyxiation. So on the shroud, we definitely see puncture marks in the feet. In the way that the legs were crossed and rigor mortis set in, they were one upon the other. They were not nailed individually. So there was a total of 3 nails used in this individual. And that's evidenced here. So I'm going to go through this one. And so now Jesus dies on the cross. That's mentioned in the Gospels as well. But this here is, again, to just show you positions people can be placed in on a crucifixion. And all your weight will be pulling down just on your arms, which is why nails through the palms couldn't support that weight. But another thing happened, though, that was a little different, is they needed to rush this death because the Passover was coming, Sabbath was coming. And if this man were to stay on the cross and live for the next 12 hours, that would have been inconvenient for many people, including the Roman soldiers and including the Jews who wanted to bury him. And so what they did is they pierced him in the side. They didn't break his legs like they may have done, and they did it to the other 2 thieves hanging on the cross. But they did this instead because they felt he was already dead. And if he was already dead, they just needed to make sure he was really dead, because they didn't want to take this man down from the cross and then have him be resuscitated in some shape or form, which probably would have been highly unlikely, but either way, they made sure. So they used the typical Roman lance. And, you know, we always say it's Longinus who was the centurion who did this. But what happens when you pierce the side of an individual who's been through this type of torture and suffering, either dead or alive, there's an accumulation of a lot of liquid in the space around the lungs and around the heart. So when you pierce that individual, immediately to come out would be serum, which is a liquid, a semi-clear liquid, as well as blood. And that's testified to as well in the Gospels. So this is, again, this kind of a schematic of what would happen if a lance was sent through one side. One little note here of interest is the blood type that's ascertained on the shroud, because they did get enough samples to actually run blood typing. And what's interesting, they found that it was AB, okay, which is kind of one of the less common blood types in the world. Maybe about 3% of humans will have AB blood type. And why the word male is put here, say, well, how do you know that from a blood type? Well, you really don't. But there have been some studies that they extracted enough DNA from some of the samples to actually get a chromosomal study. And they think they saw an XY. I am not totally convinced of that piece of the science yet, but either way, the image on the shroud is a male. And all the blood samples taken on the shroud are from the same type of person, so it's not a mixture of bloods. It's a schematic, again, of the piercing of the side. And then, of course, he was buried. And we know that from the Gospels, and that would have been typical. When the body was taken down from the cross, would have been buried by the family. Bodies that were not claimed by the family, by the way, were left there to be eaten by vultures or by wild dogs. So that was also a possibility in Roman execution time. But in this case, as we know from the Gospels, that the body was wrapped in linen and placed in a tomb, not washed in the usual fashion, planning to do it later, which attests to the fact why there is so much blood staining that remained on the shroud. So there is one interesting paper, actually in the Journal of American Medical Association, which is kind of unusual for medical journals to run an article that actually deals with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So a lot of the schematic pictures that you saw here tonight were actually taken from that journal, and it was published in 1986. But the physicians, the pathologists who actually examined the shroud, in their mind there was no no doubt that the image on the shroud is that of a crucified man, a man who was also crowned with thorns. And they hypothesized that probably death occurred from asphyxiation because he couldn't breathe anymore. But it's a very in-depth paper. And that piece of information to me kind of nailed it for me, if you would, that this was actually not a fraud. There were lots of things about this cloth that could never be explained scientifically till today. But the thing that really is most amazing to me is that despite all the naysayers about that this cloth is a forgery, no one has ever been able to come up with a theory on how you can leave an image such as this on a piece of cloth and have it reproduced as a photographic negative and be consistent with all the findings that we know of modern medicine and modern anatomy that someone in the Middle Ages never could have known. And so for me, that's why this is really it was the clincher that this is really, this relic, if you would, really represents the burial cloth of Jesus. So the end is near, and I know my wife always gives me the high five saying it's time. I would like to stop here and leave open for some questions. And also in the handouts that that you were given before, there's also a suggested reading list. So if anybody's really interested in doing their own reading and research, if you could, these books are all available on Amazon at this point. But the websites actually are very good to go through. You can find so much stuff there, a lot more than I was able to tell you in this short period of time. When I was talking earlier about images of Christ's face, etc., I have a lot that can be reviewed, and that we don't have the time for that now. But just to tell you that the face on the shroud is the face that we usually recognize Jesus in our iconography, in our artwork today, and has been ever since the 5th or 6th century. And it's for the reason that it was at that point in time that this cloth was recognized as being the face of Christ. Everything before that, Jesus was totally, didn't look like we recognize it to be. So I'm going to leave this open for questions. Father, I don't know how you want to, can we just call them as they come along? Yep. Yes. No, the actual shroud itself is the photographic negative. And because it's just, when you look at the faces, let me go back to one of the face pictures. I'll get it. When I want to show you the side-by-side one, because this is a concept which is hard to kind of wrap your head around. So we'll use this picture as an example. When you look at the clearer version on the left, the face looks a lot like you would see in those negatives that you would when you developed a film, right? It's pretty distorted and is inverse lighting on it. Whereas when you look at the negative, the actual negative film from the picture you snap of the shroud, it actually is a positive image. So that too is part of the mystery. How can a cloth that would have been fabricated by somebody, some artist, some forgerer, would have had no concept of this photographic negative, positive negative results? It just was not possible to anyone even before in the 1700s. They wouldn't have even known that. So this is why it's deemed as a negative. And as I mentioned earlier, the original negatives, such as this, the original photography, wasn't as clear because of the type of machinery used. But when you go on to more modern photography, you're able to even get clearer pictures of what that is. Thank you. The other questions? Yes.
What about the carbon-14 dating?
Yeah, the good question. Carbon-14 dating has been probably one of the pieces of the science that has been argued about the most ever since they did it. You know, when I mentioned earlier that the shroud had undergone multiple episodes of fires, etc., and also sewing on of new pieces of cloth. So what happened with the carbon-14 is that they decided to take it from a lateral strip of the cloth. And interestingly enough, it just happens to be a piece of the cloth that was also sewn by the nuns. And so there were two theories that tried to discredit the carbon-14 results, which said this is definitely a forgery, which was probably a cloth that dates anywhere from the 12 to the 1400s, blah, blah, blah. And they did it with such surety that it left no doubt it couldn't be otherwise. Well, yes and no. So what winds up happening is that further studies that were done show that, because they took papyruses from the Egyptian desert, they took mummy wrappings as well, that we know what era they're from. They subjected those pieces of materials to carbon-14 dating, and it was able to pretty much get it within 100 years that we know, right? Now you subject those same pieces of cloth, papyrus, mummy wrappings to carbon from fires, from either that or extreme heat, one or the other, even if it wasn't burnt, you mess up your dating by about 500 to 700 years. And there's a lot that I can say about this, but there is material in linen called vanillin, which is a protein in linen fiber, which degrades at a certain rate. We know, so if we have linens from the year 100, by the year 2000, there should be a certain rate of degradation of that particular protein, and so you're able to get a somewhat of a close, accurate look of how old this is when you look for that product. So the lignin and the vanillin on the shroud linen differs depending on where on the shroud you take it. You take your sample. So samples that were closest to the burn areas degraded more, and so the dating was totally off. So there's a lot of controversy. At the end of the day, and I can just tell you this, that a recent article came out in 2014 by scientists who really, this is their job, is just to look at carbon-14 dating and dating other things. Certainly the shroud's not their primary interest, but dating anything. And they believe that, in fact, the carbon-14 dating on the shroud is totally off because of the history of it, the fires, and also fibers taken from other parts of the shroud, which would have been newer, which would have been consistent with the 1300s. So that whole piece is really off. That of all the forensic sciences that were done on this cloth, that's the only one that's inconsistent, but now we have reasons to know why it's inconsistent, whereas originally it wasn't revealed to the public that that was a possibility. So that's probably as much as I could say, because that's another hour lecture. Okay, so, other questions? Yes?
Jesus cried out with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. How could someone go through all this and be able to cry out with a loud voice?
That's a good question, but don't know. I mean, obviously, one can always finds the power at the last minute to do things in a superhuman fashion, if you would. But we have to believe the Gospels that in fact that did happen, right? But the one thing we do know is that this man did not survive the crucifixion. Does that help? I mean, you know, it's not inconsistent with anything. It's just saying that those were his last words. Yeah. Yes. Can hear. Yes. And that's, well, the DNA testing that they're able to do, because don't forget, blood degrades rather quickly. And really what they're able to ascertain is blood type, for sure. And as I mentioned, there was some studies that said that they thought that they were able to actually derive chromosome types, meaning XY, which would indicate a male, as opposed to a female. But the one thing for sure, apart from the AB blood typing, is that it is human blood. Okay, because another theory had been, for those people who wanted to claim that this was a medieval forgery, is that they would use animal blood or whatever just to put blood on a cloth. Who would know the difference? But you can't get any more detail than that, simply because of degradation. Blood is a protein, and over time it just degrades so much that there's not too much you can really do. So we couldn't tell much more than that. Okay. Yes.
Another question. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 13, it reads, "When you come, bring the cloth which I left to us with tablets and books, especially the parchments." I can understand the books and the parchments, but with the cloth,
The cloths? We don't know. Now, just to confuse you a little bit more, in the tomb, or at least you remember when John goes to the tomb, Peter, he sees the cloths, plural, right? And there's the sudarium and the sindon. The sudarium is typically a face cloth. And there are also bandages, probably, to keep the jaw closed, rigor mortis, and also to keep the arms and the legs together. So multiple cloths. This cloth represents purely the shroud, in other words, the larger linen. But there were other cloths that are mentioned in the gospel, and even in tradition, there is something called the sudarium, or the face cloth of Oviedo. Oviedo is in Spain. And what's interesting, and I have photos, but I'm not going to show it because that'll take forever. You overlay that face cloth that's in Oviedo with the face what you see on the shroud, and the blood stains are very synchronous. The only thing, there's no image on there. All it is a cloth with blood stains. And that is venerated actually in Spain as an actual face cloth of the burial face cloth of Christ. So that's an interesting one. And so I think the plural that's used in the Gospels to talk about the cloths was meaning that this was just not the only piece there. The other thing that's very interesting is that if this cloth were on a dead man and the blood had clotted, when you pull it off of that body, you're going to distort a lot. Now the cloths, I mean, we don't have certainty in the Gospels, but the cloths were found, where they were. So the theory on, well, how's the image formed? Was the man unwrapped from this, or did he just disappear from within? And I mean, we can all have a concept of what the resurrection of Christ may have been, but I didn't get into this, but the only way you can leave images like this on any material, whether it be cloth or it be on a concrete wall, is radiation. And there's a lot of speculation about how this image could have been left. And personally, I'd like to believe it's that moment of the resurrection, but I mean, we can never really prove it. But because there is no answer as to really how an image is left like this, which is only the microfilaments of the upper layer of those threads, no penetration deeper than that. And that's the interesting part. Whereas all other the fluids, the blood, the serum from the side, etc., penetrate through and through like you would expect. So that's another side of the mystery of this cloth, indeed. Questions?
Excuse me, Doctor. Not
Yes.
a question, just a quick announcement. For anybody who has a question, please find either Mark or myself in the interest of hearing the questions, and we'll give you the microphone just so everybody may hear it, please.
Just what is the explanation for being negative? Is it because of the light that comes out of in the resurrection time?
Well, I mean that's my supposition anyway. But that would be it. I mean, it has to be created by a pulse of light or energy in order to really do that. And so that is the ongoing supposition. And what's really interesting, that has been debated ever since they started to do scientific studies on the cloth. And today, more and more of the forensic scientists behind it are really believing that it had to do with a burst of light or burst of energy. Other questions? Yeah.
So you said that the cross that was probably used was probably a T-shaped cross. So does that mean that the icons and the depictions that we have of the cross aren't really that accurate compared to what happened in real life?
Well, throughout Christian history, crosses have been depicted in many different ways, right? All we can say is that the typical cross that we use in most of our churches, is the standard cross, right? Crosses like that were used, but what they're saying, perhaps in this case, And what may have been more used in Palestine under the Romans was the tau cross or the T cross. Again, no way to really know that. And then don't forget, on top of the cross would have been placed the titulus, which would have been the writing, right? Jesus, Nazareth, King of the Jews. That would have stood on top of the T cross and still made it look like this. And for those of you who are familiar with the Russian cross, which is the 3-bar cross, the bottom piece, which is kind of tilted, is very interesting on how that comes about historically. But pious tradition has it that the tilted up portion is actually pointing towards the good thief who is going to God's kingdom, whereas the other one is going in the other direction. But there also was some old Russian tradition that believed that Jesus was lame because one leg must have been shorter than the other. And obviously that was Russian folktale tradition to explain why the 3rd bar on that cross was crooked. Either way, crosses have been depicted differently throughout history, all for whatever their reasons were. But the tau cross actually is an ancient symbol as well. To me, it's indifferent what the real cross looked like. But here, from just a mechanistic perspective, how would they mount a cross beam? If the crosses that had a long steepest, the longer up and down bar, in order to get the cross bar, the cross arms on that, they have to be hoisted up because they were high. Whereas the T-cross didn't need to be hoisted. It could be lifted by 3 or 4 Roman soldiers and just placed on top. There would have been a notch in the wood to keep it up on there. So, yeah. So there is no right and wrong. A cross is a cross. Yes?
I have 2 questions. The first question is the spear. When he get pierced on the right side or the left side?
It was on the right side.
The right side.
Yeah.
So my second question is just to rephrase his question. We know any person get crucified, he die by asphyxia, he cannot breathe.
Right.
And in order to scream before you die, it does not match this person on the cross, or this person die with like choking and die. So that's, I think, to rephrase his question. Another thing is, I heard, I'm not sure how accurate is this, and Christ, like the way he died with like ruptured heart.
Yeah, there was that theory too, that in fact, in order for the amount of fluid that was attested to in the gospel when the lance was used, meant that there had to be a large collection of free blood in the cavity. Either way, people who were tortured, even burn patients, for instance, will accumulate a large amount of fluid in the pericardial space as well as in the space around the lungs. So it's just hard to say what exactly the gospel writer witnessed. Yes, probably a large amount of fluid, but was it from pericardial effusion? Was it from a ruptured heart, which could occur under severe torture or pain? But either way, it was blood and water. Now, getting back to the part, though, about the last words that Jesus spoke, it didn't mean, if someone were able to push themselves up and get enough air into their lungs so that diaphragm can relax, you could still utter something. Okay, so it's not really inconsistent. Don't forget, Jesus died before the lance was used, okay? And because they didn't have to break his legs in order to accelerate the death, and that was the whole story there. So that's really not too inconsistent. I don't find that to be troubling at all, really. Yes?
Looking at the pictures, looking at the spots where the nails are in the wrist and in the feet, when I feel that same area in my wrist and my foot, I find a lot of bones there. So how do we say, I know in the arm itself there's a space, but when I go up to the wrist, where that seems to be, there's a lot of bones there.
Oh yeah,
So-
and there are, and they're all floating surfaces, one against the other. I wish I can go back on this one. There are spaces in the wrist which will give way. if you mind me taking you to that picture, that will give way to a piercing of some sort. And don't forget, the Romans were doing this as a matter of form. They just didn't do this once a year. They did this all the time. So they really knew what to aim for. I'm not saying that the crude soldier was an anatomist, but they pretty much had their art form down pat. So if you look at this one, for instance, you see in the schematic where the square, which would be the cross-section of a nail would be, that area there gives to pressure. And now you're inserting something that's pointed, so it's like a pencil point. You can actually work it through. That's not that unusual. And the same thing would happen within the carpals of the foot. Because I know a lot of people say, well, doesn't it say in the Gospels that, no bone shall be broken? And it's technically all possible that it would happen that way. So again, from an anatomical perspective, it's possible to drive any metal object without necessarily going through bone, but going through the actual spaces in between the bones. I think this is the spot here that I wanted to show you was the desto spot, which is kind of the area used, which was done actually in these other studies that they had done on dead individuals, on cadavers. It was actually to find where is this spot that you can drive an instrument through without going through the bone. So the book, one of the books that actually is on your handout there, it's called A Doctor at Calvary by Dr. Barbet. He was a French anatomist, physician, who was one of the first to really write about this. It's a very interesting book, so if any of you here are in medical school, I recommend it, because it actually does give you great insights anatomically. Yes?
You mentioned about the Jewish photographer from the original Shroud project,
Yes.
who became a believer or a Christian.
Yes.
Was any other member of the team affected in a way or another?
It was a very interesting mix of individuals, especially for the Americans that took part of this study out of this NASA group. Barry Schwartz was not a scientist. He was a photographer par excellence. But the scientific folks that were involved, a lot of them were your typical scientist, atheist. I don't believe in any of this stuff because I can explain it all. Only one individual in that group remained a diehard atheist to his dying day because he was fixated on proving that this was not the burial shroud of Christ. All the other people were touched so deeply that it deepened their religious faith. Most of them were Christians. There were Southern Baptists. There were people who were maybe, not interested in stuff like this. That's papist stuff, leave it to them. Actually, they were deeply moved by their own findings, from their own scientific findings. I find that quite interesting. Barry's story, on the other hand, I really didn't know that until much later, that he actually, he was your classic secular Jew, besides. And all of a sudden, he found Jesus, and he found it because of what he did here. And the Spirit worked through this for him, that's for sure. Other questions?
Thank you, Doctor. We have just one more.
Sure.
You.
I have a three-part question, but it's pretty quick.
Go slow, I can't remember after the first.
In terms of the crucifixion, did you mention that he was tied as well as nailed, or just nailed?
No, we don't know. In many cases, they could have been tied, but we just don't know in this case. There doesn't seem to be evidence from the flow of blood up on the arms. You see here? We would imagine that if somebody had a large amount of ropes tied around their arms, that the flow of blood would have been interrupted, so we would have seen kind of a space, a lacuna. So it makes me believe that that probably wasn't the case with this shroud finding.
In terms of the cross, the gospel mentions that there was a sign on top saying, "This is the King of the Jews."
Yes.
If it was a tau cross.
Yeah, they would put it right on top.
Okay.
So it would have been stuck on the very top of the steep edge. So it would have made it look like a four-pointed cross. And again, we don't know.
And lastly, considering that Christ was from the Middle East and from Israel, all the pictures usually depict him with blonde hair, blue eyes. Is that typical to that part of the world?
Not necessarily. You know, it's just hard to say what actually skin tone was like or hair color. The one thing that we do know from the shroud, though, that we can pick out that most of the time we're never going to see depicted on Jesus, and actually it's up here, is in the back of the neck, you see hair that's very long and seems to be tied like kind of in a ponytail. We know that was typical of the Jews that belonged to the Essene group, and we're not sure. I mean, this could also be because he had long flowing hair and it was wet, and it just accumulated that way. But that's just hard to say. I mean, a lot of people like to read into this and saying, oh, this is evidence that he belonged to a sect, because, you know, your standard Jew would have not worn their hair that way. I don't know. It's all supposition. But yeah, unfortunately, I wish we can say that we knew what Christ's face looked like, skin color, eye color, but we'll leave. You know, personally, I'm happy with my own iconography, and I'll just leave it at that. So, was that it, Father?
Yeah, let's thank Dr. Altamore for her very nice presentation.